the day Thomas Blackwell rode into Harlan Creek with nothing but 30 scraggly acres, a debt that could sink a river barge, and a last name that made grown men spit on the ground. Nobody in town gave him more than a week before he turned tail and disappeared like every other Blackwell before him. Harlan Creek sat in the dusty belly of southern Kansas in the spring of 1878, a town that had clawed itself out of the prairie soil through sheer stubbornness and the occasional good cattle season. It had a main street of packed earth, a general store run by a man named Orville Potts who wrote everything down in a ledger he treated like holy scripture, a saloon called the Red Spur that stayed loud most nights, a small Baptist church that stayed quiet most mornings, and a sheriff named Dale Hutchins who had been in the job so long his badge had permanently bent the shape of his shirt pocket. There was a livery, a blacksmith, a feed store, and a modest boarding house run by a widow woman named Mrs. Clara Finch. It was not a glamorous town, but it was a real one, and the people in it had opinions that ran deep and long. The Blackwell name had its own chapter in Harlan Creek's history, and none of the pages were flattering. Thomas's father, Elias Blackwell, had bought 30 acres of land on the south edge of town nearly a decade before, borrowed money from half the merchants in the county to build a farmhouse and stock a cattle operation, and then slowly, painfully, spectacularly failed at all of it. When Elias died of a chest infection 2 years prior, he left behind debts, a crumbling farmhouse, and a reputation so tattered that most people assumed the land itself was cursed. His oldest son, Warren Blackwell, had shown up briefly after the funeral, taken one look at the state of things and ridden west without a word. That left Thomas. Thomas was 26 years old, broad across the shoulders from years of working other men's ranches across Nebraska and Colorado, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples when it was warm, and eyes the color of creek water after a hard rain, that particular shade of gray-green that could look either stormy or calm depending on the light. He was not a man given to much talk, but when he did speak, he chose his words with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew that words, once said, could not be unsaid. He had come back to Harlan Creek not because he wanted to, but because he believed a debt was a debt, and a man's name, however battered, was still the only thing that truly belonged to him. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April, riding a roan horse he called Pepper, with a bedroll behind the saddle and a sum of money that was enough to begin, but not nearly enough to finish. He tied Pepper at the post outside Orville Potts's general store and went inside to buy flour, salt, coffee, and a box of nails. And the silence that fell when he said his name to Orville Potts was the kind of silence that had weight to it. Orville Potts was a narrow man with round spectacles and the permanent expression of someone calculating interest. He looked at Thomas over those spectacles for a long moment. "Blackwell," he said, as if tasting something sour. "Elias' boy." "His youngest," Thomas said. "I am here to settle what my father owed and to work the land. I would like to pay down the debt in installments, and I intend to honor every one of them." Orville Potts wrote something in his ledger. "Your father said something similar," he remarked, without looking up. "I am not my father," Thomas said quietly, and laid his money on the counter. That exchange was repeated in various forms all over town that week. At the feed store, at the livery when he arranged boarding for Pepper, at the sheriff's office when Dale Hutchins came by the land just to look at Thomas standing in the broken doorway of the farmhouse with a hammer in his hand, as if deciding whether he was a problem that needed handling. Thomas just nodded at the sheriff and went back to pulling warped boards off the porch. What Thomas did not know, that first week, was that he was being watched with considerably more charitable eyes from the window of the Harlan Creek schoolhouse, which sat on a slight rise at the east end of Main Street and had a clear view, on a bright morning, all the way down to the South Road and the overgrown edge of the Blackwell property. Beatrice Mercer was 23 years old and had been teaching the children of Harlan Creek for nearly 2 years. having come to town from Abilene, where her uncle had arranged her position after the death of both her parents in a wagon accident the previous winter. She was not originally from this part of Kansas, and that outsideness gave her a perspective on Harlan Creek that the people who had been born into its opinions did not share. She was a woman of medium height with warm brown eyes and dark auburn hair that she kept pinned back sensibly during school hours, and that had a tendency, by late afternoon, to escape in soft pieces around her face. She was practical in her dress and her manner, thoughtful in her speech, and possessed of a particular quality that the children in her classroom recognized instinctively, and that the adults in town had not quite figured out yet, which was that she paid attention to what people did more carefully than she listened to what people said about them. She had heard the talk about Thomas Blackwell before he arrived, because the talk preceded him by at least a week. She had heard it in the general store, in the church vestibule after Sunday services, and in the small house she rented from Mrs. Clara Finch, where the walls were thin and Clara Finch had opinions about everything. Beatrice had listened to all of it with a measured quiet, and then on that Tuesday morning, from the window of the schoolhouse during the noon recess while her students ate their lunches, she had watched Thomas Blackwell ride down the South Road on his roan horse, sit up straight in the saddle despite what had to be exhaustion, and stop in front of the general store. And something about the way he sat on that horse, something about the set of his shoulders and the lack of apology in his posture, even when he was riding into a town that had already decided what to think of him, made her decide before she had ever spoken a word to him that the talk was probably wrong. She met him properly on a Thursday, 9 days after his arrival. She had been carrying a load of books from the schoolhouse down to the church, where she sometimes borrowed the pastor's reference texts, and the books were heavy enough that she was walking carefully and not watching the road as well as she should have been. Thomas was leading Pepper across the same road, heading from the livery to the general store, and they nearly collided at the junction of Main Street and the South Road. Thomas caught one of the books that slid from her arms before it hit the ground, and Beatrice looked up from writing the rest of the stack and found herself looking at a face she had only seen from a distance. "Thank you," she said, because that was the right response to a man catching a falling book. "No trouble," he said, and held it out to her. He glanced at the title. It was a copy of Prescott's History of the Conquest of Mexico, which was not a standard schoolroom text but which Beatrice had been meaning to read for months. His eyebrows lifted just slightly. "For my own reading," she said, feeling a small, irrational need to explain. "Not for the students." "I did not say anything," he said, and there was the smallest edge of warmth in it, not quite a smile but close. "You had an expression," she said. "I did not know I had one of those either," he said, and then he did smile briefly, and it changed his face in a way that she found herself noting with more attention than was strictly necessary for a chance encounter on a dusty road. "You are Thomas Blackwell," she said. It was not a question. "I am," he said, and he said it without flinching, which she appreciated. "I am Beatrice Mercer. I teach at the schoolhouse." She shifted the books in her arms. "If you have any children who need schooling, they are welcome." "I have no children," he said. "Just a broken farmhouse and 30 acres of Kansas stubbornness." "That sounds like something worth working on," she said. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she had the sense that he was not accustomed to people saying things like that to him in a town like this one. "It is," he said finally. "I believe it is." She walked on toward the church, and he led his horse toward the general store, and that was how it began, with a caught book and a sentence about stubbornness, and a smile that Beatrice thought about later, alone in her rented room, with considerably more frequency than she expected. The weeks that followed were hard ones for Thomas. The farmhouse needed more repair than he had initially estimated, which was saying something because his initial estimate had already been dire. The roof over the west side had developed a significant lean, and the floor in the front room had boards soft enough to give under weight. The barn was in better condition structurally, but the stalls needed reinforcing before he could use them for anything serious. He worked from sunrise to past dark most days, doing what he could alone, learning quickly that some repairs genuinely required two sets of hands. He had managed to establish a fragile sort of truce with the town's merchants through the simple mechanism of paying what he promised, on time, in full, every week. Orville Potts still watched him with the skeptical ledger-keeper's eye, but he no longer said Elia's name with that particular edge when Thomas came in. The feed store owner, a barrel-shaped man named Court Halsey, had begun treating him with the neutral businesslike courtesy that was the Western commerce equivalent of acceptance. The blacksmith, an enormous quiet man named Jonas Webb, had given Thomas a fair price on some ironwork for the barn doors without being asked twice, which Thomas counted as something close to goodwill. What Thomas could not buy or earn through ledger payments was the deeper social suspicion that surrounded his name. At the Red Spur Saloon, where he occasionally stopped for a single whiskey after a long day, there were men who went quiet when he sat down and stayed quiet in that deliberately pointed way that was worse than outright hostility, because it gave him nothing to respond to. There were ranchers in the county who had lent money to his father and lost it, and their sons had inherited not only the loss but the animosity that came with it. One of them, a young man named Cade Hargrove, whose father ran the largest cattle operation north of town, made a point of being openly unpleasant whenever he encountered Thomas, which was more often than Thomas preferred. Cade Hargrove was 25, sandy-haired, and possessed of the specific confidence that comes from having always had enough. He was not a bad man at his core, but he had grown up hearing the Blackwell name spoken like a warning, and he had absorbed that lesson thoroughly. He made comments in the saloon. He said things in the feed store that were designed to be overheard. None of it rose to the level of violence, but all of it was designed to remind Thomas, and anyone watching Thomas, that he was not welcome. Beatrice heard about most of this secondhand, through the thin walls of Mrs. Finch's boarding house and through the conversations of parents who came to speak with her about their children and invariably drifted into town gossip. She listened, and she did not participate in the dismissal. She saw Thomas on the road or in the general store perhaps twice a week, and each time they exchanged brief conversation that grew gradually longer. He told her, piecemeal, about the state of the repairs. She told him about the students, about a particularly bright boy named Samuel who she thought deserved more books than the school could afford, about the difficulty of teaching long division to children who had spent all morning doing real arithmetic with actual cattle and grain, and could not see the point of the classroom version. Thomas, who had spent his own childhood working rather than studying and who had taught himself to read adequately, but had always felt the gap in his formal education like a missing step on a staircase, listened to her talk about books and mathematics and history with a quality of attention that she noticed, and that made her feel, in a way she was not entirely accustomed to, that the things she cared about were worth caring about. One evening in late May, she was sitting on the front step of Mrs. Finch's boarding house with a book in her lap, taking advantage of the long prairie sunset, when Thomas rode by on Pepper and stopped because she raised a hand in greeting and because he was, she thought, the kind of man who stopped when someone greeted him. "You are always reading," he said, not critically, just as an observation. "You are always working," she returned, and nodded at the dark patches of exertion on his shirt, the trace of sawdust on his forearm. "The barn roof," he said. "3 more days of work, I think, if the weather holds." "Is it coming along?" she asked, and she meant it genuinely, and he could hear that she meant it. He was quiet for a moment, looking down the road in the direction of his property. "It is coming along better than most people expected," he said carefully, "and not as fast as I need it to." "What do you need it to be?" she asked. "When it is done." He looked at her then, and the late light was amber on his face, and something in his expression shifted slightly, as though he was deciding whether to answer honestly. "I need the barn done so I can board horses for the summer cattle drives," he said. I have spoken with 2 ranchers about it, men who need temporary stabling for their horses while they push cattle north. That will bring in enough to make my next debt payment and buy seed for the south field. If the south field yields through August, I should have enough by fall to begin paying down the larger creditors. It was more than he had said to anyone in Harlan Creek, she sensed. That is a good plan, she said. People in this town have their doubts about that, he said, but not bitterly, just honestly. I do not, she said, and she met his eyes when she said it, and she did not look away. He held her gaze for a moment, and something passed across his face that she did not have a name for yet, but that she thought she would eventually. That is more than I expected from this town, he said quietly. I am not from this town, she reminded him. I am from Abilene. I remember, he said. You told me that your family is there. My family is gone, she said, and kept her voice even because she had learned to keep it even, but she saw him hear the weight in those 3 words, and he did not rush past it with a platitude the way most people did. I am sorry, he said simply, and let it be what it was. They talked for another half hour, until the light was nearly gone, and Mrs. Finch could be heard moving around inside in a way that suggested she was paying attention to the conversation on her front step. Beatrice stood and said good evening, and Thomas tipped his hat and rode on, and she went inside and sat at her small table and opened her book and read none of it for quite some time. June arrived with heat and dry wind, and the distant sound of cattle drives moving north along the trails that crossed the county. Thomas had finished the barn roof, and true to his plan, he had arranged boarding contracts with 2 ranchers, a man named Prescott who ran a mid-sized operation 20 miles west, and old Clarence Dubois, who had known Thomas's father but had also known that Elias Blackwell's failures were about character rather than bloodline, and who had decided, in his careful old rancher's way, to extend Thomas the cautious benefit of that distinction. The horses came, 8 of them from Prescott and 6 from Dubois, and Thomas worked the long summer days feeding and exercising and caring for them, and the money began to come in steadily. He paid Orville Potts his installment on a June morning, and Orville Potts made a note in his ledger with what Thomas thought might have been, in a very small and very reluctant way, something approaching respect. Cade Hargrove noticed the horses in Thomas's barn. He mentioned in the saloon that Thomas Blackwell had no business taking boarding contracts when his family owed money all over the county. He said it loud enough to be heard and expected it to travel, which it did, because things said in the Red Spur always traveled. But what he found, to his visible irritation, was that some of the men who heard it no longer agreed with quite the wholehearted enthusiasm they would have shown a month before. Thomas Blackwell was paying his debts. Thomas Blackwell was keeping the horses well. Thomas Blackwell showed up every morning and worked without complaint and did not ask for credit he had not earned. It was not adoration. It was not forgiveness for sins that were not technically his. But it was the beginning of a shift, the slow recalibration of opinion that comes when reality starts disagreeing with reputation. Beatrice noticed the shift too, and it made her quietly glad. She noticed it in the way Orville Potts spoke of Thomas when she was in the general store, no longer with the same cool derision. She noticed it in the way old Clarence Dubois tipped his hat at Thomas on the street with something that was not condescension. She noticed it and felt something she recognized as pride, which surprised her because she had not, at that point, done anything to earn the right to be proud of a man she had only spoken to in the street and on a boarding house step. She found an excuse to visit the South Field one July morning, which was not as contrived as it sounds, because she had been intending to gather some of the prairie grasses for a lesson on local plant life, and the south edge of Thomas's property bordered the open grassland that ran toward the creek. She brought a basket and her botany text, and she was crouched near the fence line examining a stand of side oats grama when she heard boots in the grass and looked up to find Thomas standing a respectful 10 feet away, hat in hand. "I thought that was you," he said. "I am gathering plant samples," she said, lifting the basket as evidence. For the students, he said, and this time the small smile was there from the beginning. For the students, she confirmed. She stood and brushed dust from her skirt. Your south field looks better than it did 2 months ago. He turned and looked at it, the rows of newly planted corn standing in the dry heat, green but holding. It is getting there, he said. The soil on the west end is poor, but I found a way to compost the barn waste into it that my father never tried. Improves the drainage. That is practical thinking, she said. Desperation is a good teacher, he said dryly, and she laughed. And it was the first time he had heard her laugh. A real laugh, not the polite social kind. And he looked at her with an expression that made heat come into her face that had nothing to do with the July sun. They walked the fence line together slowly, and she asked him about the crops, and he asked her about the school. And somewhere along the walk, he stopped thinking of her as the schoolteacher he spoke to occasionally and started thinking of her as Beatrice, a specific person with specific thoughts who happened to be walking beside him in the morning sunlight with a basket of prairie grass and a botany book under her arm. And the difference between those two things was considerable. He fixed the broken rail on the north fence while she wrote in her small notebook about the plants she had collected, and they worked in a companionable quiet that neither of them mentioned afterward but that both of them thought about. When she prepared to leave, gathering her basket and her book, he walked with her to the edge of the property without quite deciding to do it. "Thank you for the walk," she said. "You came to my fence line," he pointed out. "I came for the plants," she said. "You can come for the plants whenever you like," he said, and there was nothing presumptuous in it. It was just offered openly, and she took it the same way. "I may hold you to that," she said, and walked back toward town with the basket and the botany book and the absolutely unnecessary warmth in her chest that she spent the rest of the day trying to be sensible about. She was not particularly successful at being sensible about it. July turned toward August, and the summer heat settled over Harlan Creek like a wool blanket. The cattle drives had thinned out, but the boarding arrangement continued, and Thomas's South Field corn was, against the reasonable predictions of several people who knew that soil, actually growing. Not magnificently, not in the way that would make a man rich, but solidly, steadily, in the way that suggested the land might be redeemable after all. Thomas had by this point paid down a meaningful portion of the most pressing debts, enough that Orville Potts had actually said, in the hearing of 2 other customers, that he supposed Blackwell's boy was making a genuine go of it. This was the equivalent, from Orville Potts, of a standing ovation. Thomas and Beatrice had fallen into a rhythm of seeing each other twice a week, sometimes 3 times, in the casual way that happens in small towns where people's lives overlap constantly whether or not they intend for them to. He walked past the school in the evenings when the students had gone and sometimes stopped to help her carry things or to fix the schoolroom's persistently broken window latch. She brought things to the farm occasionally, a jar of preserves she had made too much of, a book she thought he might want to read, and he always took them with the same careful gravity, as though a jar of preserves was a considered gift and ought to be received as such. He had begun to read more seriously. She had mentioned offhandedly that there were books available by mail order from a publisher in St. Louis, and he had taken note of that and ordered 2 of them, a history of the American West that she had recommended, and a practical text on soil management for dry prairie conditions. And he read them both in the evenings by lamplight and reported back to her about them, with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that the world was larger than he had previously been allowed to believe. One evening in the second week of August, he found her at the schoolhouse after hours, sitting at her desk with her face in her hands. The door was open to catch whatever breeze the evening offered, and he had been passing with every intention of not stopping, but he stopped. "Beatrice," he said. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the edges and she had clearly been crying, but she straightened immediately and put on the composed expression she used in public, and he thought it was the saddest version of courage he had ever seen. "It is nothing," she said, which was obviously not true. He came into the schoolroom and stood near the door, not crowding her. "It does not look like nothing," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I received a letter today, from my uncle in Abilene. He is suggesting it might be time for me to come back, that he has found a suitable match for me." She looked at the desk. "A man named Philip Graves. He is 41 years old and has a dry goods establishment. My uncle says it is a good situation." Thomas was silent for a moment that stretched just long enough to be meaningful. "Is that what you want?" he asked. "I have never met Philip Graves," she said. "That is not what I asked," he said quietly. She looked up at him and the composed expression cracked slightly. "No," she said. "It is not what I want. I want to stay here. I want to keep teaching." "I want to keep," she stopped herself. "Keep what?" he asked, and his voice was very even, but his hands were still on his hat brim, and she noticed that his knuckles were pale. She looked at him steadily. "I want to keep doing what I have been doing," she said, which was not quite what she had been about to say, but it was as close as honesty could bring her in that moment. He held her gaze for 3 long seconds. Then he said, "Will you walk with me?" She put down the letter and walked with him. They went down to the creek that ran at the south edge of town, where the cottonwoods were thick enough to give shade even in the fading evening light, and the water ran cool and clear over the flat limestone bottom. They walked along the bank without speaking for a while, listening to the creek and the birds settling in for night, and then Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her. "I have 30 acres of land that are only beginning to be what they should be," he said. "I have a debt that I am paying down but have not finished paying. I have a name that this town has been suspicious of since before I arrived." He paused. "I am telling you this because you deserve to know exactly what the situation is." Her heart was beating considerably faster than a walk along a creek should have produced. "I am aware of the situation," she said carefully. "What I am also telling you," he said, "is that I intend to make something of that land. The debt will be cleared by next spring if the harvest is what I think it will be and if the boarding continues through the fall." The name, he stopped, and something moved in his eyes that she thought was the most honest thing she had ever seen a man's face do. "The name I cannot promise, but I can promise you that I will not do what my father did with it." "Thomas," she said, "I am not asking you anything tonight," he said quickly. "I know what my situation is, and I know it is not enough yet. I am only telling you that I notice when you come to the fence line, and I notice when you leave. And I notice what you say, and I notice when you stop yourself from saying something. And He stopped again, and she thought he was perhaps not as practiced at this as he was at everything else. "I am aware of you," he said finally, "in a way that I have not been aware of another person before." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the creek. Then she said, "I wrote back to my uncle this morning before your letter arrived." He looked at her. "I told him that I am not interested in a suitable match arranged from a distance," she said. "I told him that I am happy in Harlan Creek and that I intend to stay." "You wrote that this morning," he said, and she could hear in his voice that he was understanding the timing. "I wrote it this morning," she confirmed, and looked at him sidelong with a small, clear smile. He exhaled slowly, and the tension went out of his shoulders in a way that made him look younger, less braced against the world. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said, which was both an answer to her name and to something he had not said yet. He reached out and took her hand carefully, as if it were something breakable, and she let him, and they stood by the creek in the late August evening while the cottonwood leaves moved in the small breeze, and the first stars appeared above the flat Kansas horizon, and it was one of those moments that people carry with them for the rest of their lives. He did not kiss her that evening. He walked her back to Mrs. Finch's boarding house and said good night with the propriety that the town and the time required, and she went inside with her heart full to the edge of something she was ready to name. August moved into September, and the corn was harvested. Not a magnificent yield, but a real and solid one that more than met Thomas's calculations. He sold the corn and made his debt payment, and the remaining sum he owed to the county's merchants was, for the first time, a number that looked manageable rather than impossible. He went to each creditor in turn and made his payment in person, and looked each of them in the eye, and most of them took his money without the old derision, because a man who kept coming back with payment, month after month without exception, was hard to continue treating as a Blackwell in the old sense. Old Clarence Dubois invited Thomas to his ranch for supper that September, which was noted by several people as a significant social endorsement. Cade Hargrove noticed it too, and his response was to escalate his irritability about the matter at the Red Spur, but he found a smaller and smaller audience for it. The horse boarding had given Thomas a visible contribution to the cattle economy of the county that people in a cattle economy tended to respect. Beatrice and Thomas took to walking together on Sunday afternoons when the school was closed and his farm work permitted, and these walks became the most anticipated part of both their weeks. They walked out to the creek, or along the old trail that ran east toward the distant line of cottonwoods, or up to the slight rise east of town, where on a clear day you could see 40 miles of Kansas in every direction, the land flat and immense and indifferent to human concerns in a way that was either terrifying or steadying depending on who you were. Thomas found it steadying. He told her that once, standing on that rise with the wind in their faces and the town behind them reduced to a small collection of brown and gray shapes. He said that the land made human arguments feel appropriately small. She said she thought that was probably a healthy perspective, but that it was easier to hold when the land was working for you. He laughed at that, a real laugh that she had heard before, but that still did something particular to her every time. He told her, on one of those walks, about his childhood, about how his father had been a man of grand plans and poor follow-through, not cruel, not mean-spirited, but constitutionally unable to do the steady, unglamorous work that turned plans into reality. About how Thomas had understood from a young age that if he wanted something different, he would have to be made of different material, and how that understanding had driven him to work on other men's ranches across 3 states, learning not just the physical work but the business of it, the calculations and the planning and the willingness to do what was needed instead of what was easy. She told him, in return, about her parents. Her father had been a schoolteacher in Abilene, which was where her love of books and learning had come from. Her mother had been a practical, warm woman who had run their household with the kind of quiet competence that holds everything together, and that people only notice when it is gone. The accident that took them had been senseless, a wagon wheel on an icy December road, and Beatrice had spent 6 months afterward in a grief so thick it was like trying to breathe water. Coming to Harlan Creek, taking the teaching position, had been partly her uncle's arrangement and partly her own instinct that the only way out of that grief was to give herself a purpose. Thomas listened to all of this with the complete attention that was becoming, she realized, one of his most characteristic qualities, and when she had finished, he did not say that it would be all right or that God had a plan or any of the other well-meaning but hollow things people said. He just said, "Your parents would be proud of what you are doing here," and she believed him in the way you believe something that you did not know you needed to hear. October came in cool and gold, and the prairie grasses went amber and rust, and the relationship between Thomas Blackwell and Beatrice Mercer became the kind of town knowledge that people in Harlan Creek discussed with a range of responses. Mrs. Clara Finch was, predictably, the most vocal. She told Beatrice one evening over supper that she thought Thomas Blackwell was a decent man who was working hard to prove it, and that she had no fundamental objection to the connection, but that Beatrice should be careful because a name like Blackwell had a way of coming back to haunt people. Beatrice thanked her for the advice and gave it the consideration it deserved, which was less than Clara Finch intended but more than none at all. The pastor's wife, a gentle woman named Mrs. Eleanor Price, stopped Beatrice after Sunday services and told her quietly that she thought Thomas Blackwell was a man of genuine character, and that if Beatrice was happy, then the Lord's church was happy for her. This was exactly the kind of social endorsement that mattered in a town like Harlan Creek, and it did not go unnoticed. Cade Hargrove noticed it, and he found it intolerable. He came to the Red Spur one October evening in a mood that the bartender, a man of some experience in moods, recognized as looking for trouble, and he made some comments about Thomas Blackwell that were louder and uglier than his usual variety, and he made some comments about Beatrice Mercer that crossed a line that men in saloons generally understood not to cross. Thomas was not in the saloon that evening. Jonas Webb, the blacksmith, was, and Jonas was a man of very few words and very direct responses to injustice. He stood up from his stool and looked at Cade Hargrove for a long moment, and said, in his measured way, that he thought Cade ought to take back the part about Miss Mercer. Cade, buoyed by whiskey and accumulated grievance, declined. There was a brief altercation that resulted in Cade sitting on the floor of the Red Spur looking surprised, and Jonas going back to his drink with the serenity of a man who had done what needed doing. Thomas heard about this the following morning from Court Halsey at the feed store, who told it with poorly concealed satisfaction. Thomas went to find Jonas at the blacksmith shop and thanked him, and Jonas shrugged with the massive, economical shrug of a man who does not require thanks for the obvious. Then Thomas went to find Cade Hargrove. He found him at the Hargrove Ranch, doing fence work on the south pasture. Cade saw him coming and his jaw set. Thomas dismounted and stood a respectful distance away and said, "I am not here for a fight." "Then turn around," Cade said. "I am here to say that my father owed your father money, and I understand what that does to a person," Thomas said. "I understand it better than most, and I am sorry for that. It was not right, what my father did." Cade was quiet for a moment, his hand still on the fence post. "I am going to pay every debt my father left," Thomas continued, "including the one to your father. I know that is not on the current creditor list because your father wrote it off before he died, but I know what was owed and I intend to pay it." Cade looked at him. "You know about that. I found my father's ledger in the farmhouse," Thomas said. "It was the one honest record he kept. The silence between them was a different kind from before, not hostile exactly, something more complicated. Beatrice Mercer is a good woman," Thomas said. "She deserves to be spoken of accordingly." Cade looked at the fence post. After a long moment he said, "She is. I should not have said what I said." It was not a reconciliation, not quite. But it was a closing of one door and possibly, in the way that careful things happen between stubborn men, the opening of another. Thomas rode back to town, and that evening he walked to the boarding house and knocked on the door, and when Beatrice came out to the step he told her what had happened. He did not dress it up or make himself the hero of it. He just told her, and she listened, and when he was done she reached out and put her hand on his arm in the simple way of someone who has run out of words for what they feel. "Thomas," she said. He looked down at her hand on his arm, and then up at her face, and the amber evening light was on both of them, and this time he did not say he was not asking her anything. "I know what I have right now is 30 acres and a debt that is getting smaller but is not gone," he said. "I know my name is still on probation with most of this town. I know I cannot offer you what other men might." He paused, and the evening was very quiet around them. "But I can offer you what I am. And what I am is a man who will work every day of his life for what matters, who will not run when things are hard, and who," he stopped and looked at her with all the honesty he possessed, "who loves you." It was the first time either of them had said it, and she felt it land in her chest like something warm and permanent. "I have trusted your name since before you gave me any reason to," she said softly. "I think I have been in love with you for nearly as long." He took her face in both hands, gentle and deliberate, and kissed her, there on the boarding house step in the October evening with the last of the amber light on the Kansas prairie, and Mrs. Clara Finch almost certainly watching from behind the curtain. And it was the kind of kiss that resolves things, the kind that takes everything that has been building and uncertain and declares it clearly. When he pulled back, she was looking at him with bright eyes and a smile that he thought was the best thing in 30 acres or 300 acres or the entire flat expanse of Kansas. "I intend to ask you properly," he said, "when the last debt is paid, "And when do you expect that to be?" she asked. "Spring," he said, "if the winter boarding holds." "Spring," she said, and took his hand, and they stood on the step together in the cooling evening, and neither of them needed to say anything more. November brought cold and the kind of gray Kansas sky that suggests the world has always been gray and always will be, and Thomas worked the winter preparations with the doubled energy of a man who has a reason to think about the future. He had taken on 4 more horses for winter boarding, ranchers who needed reliable stabling through the cold months, and the barn was warm with the smell of horses and hay and the particular comfortable closeness of good-kept animals. He had also, in a move that showed both practical thinking and an instinct for community building that his father had never possessed, started doing small farrier and repair jobs for some of the local ranchers, using skills he had picked up over his years of work. This brought in additional income and, more importantly, brought him into regular contact with the men whose opinions of his name were slowly but genuinely changing. He rode out to Clarence Dubois' ranch twice that month, once for farrier work, and once when Dubois' foreman needed an extra hand for fence repairs in the north pasture, and Dubois sat with him on the porch afterward over coffee and talked about the history of the county and the way land worked in Kansas, and the mistakes his own father had made and what Dubois had learned from them. It was the kind of conversation that men have when they have decided that another man is worth talking to, and Thomas left each time with the sense of having been given something valuable that had nothing to do with money. Beatrice visited the farm for the first time in November, on a clear cold Saturday when the sky had gone that particular winter blue that is so deep it seems to be a different color category than summer blue. Thomas had asked if she would like to see what he had done with the place, and she had said yes with the enthusiasm of someone who has wanted to be asked for a while. He walked her through the barn first, which was his pride and which deserved it. The stalls were clean and solid, the tack was organized and well-maintained, and the horses, heavy with their winter coats, regarded Beatrice with the placid curiosity of animals that were used to good care. She fed an apple to a large bay mare that belonged to Prescott's ranch and laughed when the mare investigated her coat pocket for additional contributions. Then the farmhouse. He had been working on it steadily all autumn, and the transformation from the ruin he had arrived to was significant. The porch was repaired and solid. The interior was clean and spare and functional. The main room had a good iron stove that held heat well, and he had put up new boards on the west wall that still smelled of fresh pine. The windows were small but intact. It was a plain house, not a beautiful house, but it was well made and maintained and had about it the quality of something that was genuinely cared for. She stood in the middle of the main room and turned slowly, taking it in. "It is very good work," she said. "It will be better," he said. "The kitchen needs a proper counter and the east bedroom needs a new floor. By spring I should have both done." "You are always thinking about spring," she said. "I have reasons to," he said, and looked at her steadily. She looked around the room again, and he watched her looking and thought about what it would mean to have her in this room not as a visitor, and the thought had a solidity to it, a reality that made him both certain and careful. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking that this could be a very fine home," she said, "with the right things in it." "What things?" he asked. She looked at him with her warm brown eyes. "Books," she said, "and good light in the morning and someone who reads them." He smiled. "I have been known to read." "I know," she said. "It is one of the things she stopped, and the small pause held everything she did not say. "I like about you," she finished. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said, again with that quality of the word being more than its surface. He crossed the room to her in 2 steps and kissed her in the clear cold light of the farmhouse window, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and the bay mare in the barn made a sound that was either commentary or coincidence, and they both laughed into the kiss and then kept kissing anyway. December was white and cold, and Thomas and Beatrice saw less of each other than they would have liked because the weather and the demands of the school, and the farm made every outing an exercise in bundling against the cold, and making the most of limited daylight. But they managed, with some regularity, to see each other on Sunday afternoons at the church, where they sat in the same pew with the entirely proper several inches between them that Clara Finch still maintained was appropriate. And afterward they walked together in the brief, bright, cold afternoon and talked about books and weather and the future in the oblique, but clearly understood way of people who know what they are moving toward. Thomas made his December debt payment. The remaining sum was smaller than it had ever been. He ran the numbers in his notebook by lamplight and calculated that, with the winter boarding income and the planned spring planting, he would be clear of all outstanding debt by April. He bought Beatrice a Christmas gift from Potts's General Store, a volume of poetry that she had mentioned once in passing that she would like to have and probably never thought he remembered. He had remembered. She opened it on Christmas morning, standing in the doorway of Mrs. Finch's boarding house with the cold air around her and her breath making small clouds. And when she saw what it was, her face did something that he wanted to see it do every Christmas morning for the rest of his life. She had made him a pair of wool gloves knitted herself, which she pressed on him with the same slightly nervous care with which he had given her the book, as though she was uncertain whether it was enough, and he put them on immediately there in the cold morning air and told her they were the best gloves he had ever worn, which was true in every way that mattered. They stood in the cold doorway for a moment, and he said, "I have been thinking about spring." "You are always thinking about spring," she said, laughing. "I am always thinking about you," he said simply, and she stopped laughing and looked at him with those warm, serious eyes, and he said, "I want to ask you something in April when the last debt is paid. I want you to be ready for the question." "I have been ready for the question for some time," she said. He took her hand in his new wool gloves. "Then you will not be surprised," he said. "I will be surprised," she said. "I will be very surprised and very happy, and I want you to ask it properly regardless." "I will," he said, and she believed him, and they stood in the Christmas cold with the Kansas sky white above them, and everything ahead of them felt like the good kind of wide open. January was the hardest month, as January in Kansas generally is. The temperature dropped to levels that made outdoor work not just unpleasant but dangerous, and Thomas was largely confined to the farmhouse and barn, doing what could be done inside while the wind made the prairie sound like a living thing in discomfort. He worked on the kitchen counter, which he was building from lumber he had been stockpiling, and on the east bedroom floor, and he read in the evenings with the iron stove ticking heat into the room, and he wrote in his notebook plans and calculations, and occasionally other things that were not plans or calculations. He wrote to Beatrice as well, short notes that he sent over with whoever was heading into town, and she wrote back longer notes because she had always been more comfortable in writing than he was, and because the schoolroom gave her a warm place to write by day. These letters, passed back and forth across the cold distance between the farmhouse and the boarding house, had a quality of intimacy that their careful face-to-face conversations had not quite reached yet. She told him things in writing that she was still working toward saying aloud. He told her in his careful and deliberate way what the farm looked like in the snow, how the horses stood in the barn with their big sides steaming in the cold, how the prairie at night in January was a kind of silence he did not have words for. She wrote back that she thought silence was one of the most undervalued things in a life, and that she appreciated that he understood it, because most people could not sit with silence without filling it. He read that letter 3 times. February brought a brief thaw and then harder cold, and Cade Hargrove came to the farmhouse one February afternoon, unannounced, which made Thomas's hand go briefly toward his belt before he saw that Cade's horse was tied at the fence, and Cade was standing on the porch with his hat in his hand, which was not the body language of trouble. Thomas opened the door and said, "Hargrove." "Blackwell," Cade said. "I'm not here to cause anything. I wanted to—" He stopped and tried again. "My father's ledger." What he had written off. "I went through it after what you said, and I know the amount." "I know the amount," Thomas said. "I am not here to collect it," Cade said. What I am saying is, I know you are still paying down other debts and what you told me about your intention. Another stop. Cade Hargrove was not a man accustomed to this kind of conversation. You do not have to pay it, he said finally. My father wrote it off. It is written off. Thomas looked at him for a moment. I appreciate that, he said. I still intend to pay it. Cade stared at him. You are a peculiar man, Blackwell. I am a man who pays his debts, Thomas said. Your father gave my father something. I intend to return it. The two men looked at each other across the porch in the cold February air, and something shifted between them that was not quite friendship, but was something in the same family. Cade nodded once, put his hat back on, and left. Thomas watched him go and then went back inside and added the Hargrove amount to his spring payment calculations. March arrived with mud and the smell of thawing ground, and the cattle ranchers began talking about the spring drives, and there was work to be arranged and horses to be accounted for. Thomas had 5 spring boarding commitments by the second week of March, more than the previous year, because his reputation as a man who kept good care of animals had preceded him now through the network of ranchers and cattle hands that moved through the county. Orville Potts stopped him on the street one March morning and said, without preamble, "You are the only man in this county who has paid down a debt like that ahead of schedule." He said it as if reporting a fact, which it was. I had reasons to stay on schedule, Thomas said. Orville Potts looked at him for a moment. I expect you will clear the last of it this spring, he said. April, Thomas said. Before the end of April. Good, Orville Potts said, as if he had decided something himself and walked on. Thomas smiled at the man's back just slightly. The April morning Thomas made his final debt payment was a clear morning with the sky so pale and wide it seemed to be the first sky ever made, that particular quality of early spring Kansas air that makes everything look just slightly more real than usual. He went to Orville Potts first, because Potts was the largest remaining creditor and because beginning there felt right. He put the money on the counter, counted out precisely, and said, "That is the last of it." Orville Potts looked at the money. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he opened his ledger, found the Blackwell entry, and drew a single line through it with his pen. It was, for Orville Potts, an act of ceremony. "Debt settled," Potts said. "In full." Thomas paid the other remaining creditors through the morning, and by noon he had made every payment. He stood on the main street of Harlan Creek in the April sun, free of every penny his father had borrowed and not repaid, and he felt the lightness of it like a physical thing, the way a man feels when he has been carrying something so long he had forgotten the weight, and then sets it down and suddenly understands how heavy it was. He went to the schoolhouse at the noon recess. Beatrice was outside with the students, watching over their lunch hour with the easy authority of a woman who knew exactly how much freedom and how much supervision 10 children needed at once. She saw him coming up the road and her face changed in the way he had come to know as his own, that particular brightening that he believed nobody else caused. "All of it," he said when he reached her, before she could ask. Her face lit up completely, without reservation, and she stepped toward him without thinking about the students who were watching with the acute interest children show in any adult behavior that seems significant. "Every cent," she said. "Every cent," he confirmed. She stopped just in front of him, within arm's reach, both of them aware of the audience and both of them not entirely caring. She looked at him with those warm brown eyes that he had been looking at for almost a year now and that he intended to look at every day for the rest of his life. "You said you wanted to ask me something in April," she said. "I do," he said. "Then ask," she said softly. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small ring, which he had made from 2 twisted bands of silver that he had worked himself at Jonah's Webb's forge on 3 separate evenings over the course of the winter, the metalwork careful and deliberate in the way of everything he did. He was not a jeweler, and the ring showed that, but it also showed the hours of careful intention that had gone into it, the particular quality of something made rather than purchased. "Beatrice Mercer," he said, and the schoolchildren had gone entirely silent behind her in the way that children do when they understand that something real is happening. I had 30 acres and a debt, and a name that nobody in this town trusted when I came here. You trusted it before I had done a single thing to earn that trust, and it made me want to be the man you seemed to think I was." He paused, and his voice was steady, but something in his eyes was not, and she was very glad of both things. "I am asking you to be my wife. I am asking you to share that land and whatever we build on it, and I am promising you that I will spend every year giving you reasons to go on trusting the name." There were several things she wanted to say, several responses that would have been eloquent and meaningful and would have done justice to the moment. What she actually said was, "Yes, Thomas, yes." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it with the expression of someone who has just been given exactly the right thing. And then he pulled her into his arms there on the road in front of the schoolhouse in the April sunlight, and she let him, and several of the schoolchildren cheered with considerable enthusiasm. They were married in June in the Baptist church, on a morning when the Kansas sky was the deep, pure blue of high summer. Pastor Price performed the ceremony, and the church was full, not because Harlan Creek society had entirely forgotten the name Blackwell, but because over the course of a year, through the accumulation of small honest actions, Thomas had persuaded enough of the town to see what Beatrice had seen from a boarding house step in that first April. That a man is not his father's failures, and that stubborn, patient goodness is its own argument. Clarence Dubois sat in the third row and nodded at Thomas with the dignity of an old man, acknowledging something done right. Orville Potts sat near the back and maintained his habitual expression, but was there. Jonas Webb, enormous in a collar that appeared to be causing him some distress, sat beside Court Halsey, and both of them looked satisfied in the way of men who have watched something take root and grow. Cade Hargrove sat near the side wall and looked at the proceedings with an expression that had lost most of its old animosity and acquired something more complicated, something that Thomas, who saw him from the front of the church, thought might be something like respect. Mrs. Clara Finch wept, which surprised everyone including Clara Finch. Beatrice came up the aisle in a dress of pale blue cotton that she had made herself over the previous weeks, simply cut and simply trimmed, practical in the way of everything she was and beautiful in the same way, with her auburn hair pinned up and the silver ring on her left hand already, because she had not wanted to take it off in the weeks since he put it there. She looked at Thomas standing at the front of the church, and he looked at her, and the look between them had the quality of a conversation that had been going on for a year and would go on for the rest of their lives. Pastor Price spoke the words and they spoke theirs, and when Thomas said "I do," he said it with the same quiet certainty with which he did everything, and when Beatrice said "I do," she said it clearly and fully, without reservation, and meant every syllable. He kissed her in the light coming through the church windows, and the congregation made the sounds that congregations make when something has gone exactly as it should. They had a small gathering at the Price house afterward, with food that half the town had contributed and sweet tea, and a layer cake that Mrs. Eleanor Price had baked with the serious attention she gave to things that mattered. It was not a lavish wedding, and it was not meant to be, but it was warm and full and real, and Beatrice stood in the middle of it with Thomas beside her and his hand in hers, and thought that she had come to Harlan Creek to find a purpose and had found, instead, something larger. They drove out to the farm in the late afternoon in the wagon Thomas had borrowed from Dubois for the occasion, and Beatrice looked at the farmhouse in the June sunlight with the porch solid and painted, and the kitchen inside with its new counter, and the east bedroom with its new floor, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a life that is making itself around you in all the right directions. "Welcome home," Thomas said, and she looked at him, and the word home had a meaning it had not had since the winter of her parents' death, a warmth and a fullness that she had not been sure she would find again. "Home," she said, and meant it completely. The summer was good. Beatrice continued teaching through the fall, as there was no rule against a married woman teaching in Harlan Creek, and she had made clear from the beginning that she intended to continue. And Thomas made no argument because he knew it was part of who she was, and because he had no interest in removing anything from her that was essential to her being herself. She planted a kitchen garden behind the farmhouse with a focused precision that was entirely her own, and she brought her books inside and put them on the shelves Thomas had built along the east wall of the main room. And the sight of her books mixed with his 2 volumes from St. Louis made the house look like what it was, a place where 2 specific and particular people had chosen to make their lives. He worked the land and the horses with the same steady commitment, and by the end of the first summer they were planting, he had the south field in sorghum and a small expansion to the north quarter that he was clearing carefully, and with an eye toward the following year's planting. In October of their first married year, Beatrice told Thomas that she was expecting their first child. She told him on a Sunday evening by the iron stove, in the way she had of saying important things. Simply, directly, with her eyes on his face to see what the news did to it. What it did was make him look like a man who has been handed something he did not dare want too openly, and is not quite sure yet what to do with the intensity of wanting it. He stood up from his chair and crossed to her in 2 steps and took both her hands, and she could feel that his hands were not entirely steady. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I am happy." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, "I am going to be a father." "You are," she said. "I intend to be a different kind of father," he said, and she knew what he meant, and she said, "I know that. You already are." He pulled her to him carefully, as if she were suddenly more fragile, which she found both touching and unnecessary, and she let him because she understood what he was feeling, which was something enormous and tender and a little terrifying. The winter of their first year was different from the previous one. The farmhouse was warmer because Beatrice was particular about keeping the stove fed, and because 2 people generate more warmth than one, and because there were now curtains on the windows and braided rugs on the floors, and the kitchen smelled regularly of bread and dried herbs from the kitchen garden. Thomas read to her in the evenings, having progressed beyond the initial uncertain way of a man who learned to read without much guidance into a reader of genuine pleasure, and she lay on her side on the settle with her feet tucked up and listened to his voice read history and poetry, and the occasional cattle management text, which she found, in his particular voice, oddly compelling. Cade Hargrove came by the farm that December, and this time it was not charged in any way. He came to discuss a possible arrangement for spring boarding, because his father's ranch was expanding and they needed reliable stabling nearby. They stood in the barn and talked business, and at the end of it shook hands, and when Cade left, Thomas watched him ride off and thought that the distance between people was rarely fixed, that it could be crossed if both parties were willing to move, even slowly. He came inside and told Beatrice about it, and she said, "I am glad," and went back to hemming the small shirt she was making, and he sat across from her and watched her hands work and thought that this, exactly this, the warmth and the ordinary and the woman with her brown eyes bent over her sewing, was the thing worth working every acre of that land for. The baby came in March of 1880, born in the farmhouse with the county midwife, a capable woman named Harriet Cole, in attendance, and Thomas outside on the porch in the cold because that was where men were expected to be, and because if he had been inside he would not have been any use at all. He heard the first cry from the porch and stood up so fast he knocked his coffee off the rail, and Harriet Cole opened the door not 5 minutes later and said he could come in. The baby was a boy, pink and loud and already looking, Beatrice said, exactly like his father, which she meant as the highest compliment. Thomas held him in his arms with the careful reverence of a man, holding the most significant thing he has ever been trusted with, and looked down at the small red face, and his expression was something Beatrice committed entirely to memory. They named him James Elias Blackwell, James for no one in particular except that it was a solid name that stood on its own, and Elias for Thomas's father, not because the man had been what he should have been, but because the name was part of what Thomas had come from, and Thomas was not a man who hid from where he had come from. "Are you sure you want to give him that name?" Beatrice asked, when they were discussing it gently. "I want to give him the chance to make it mean something different," Thomas said. "The same way I had to make Blackwell mean something different. He will have a head start because of what you and I build here, but the name should stay in it." She looked at the baby in her arms and thought that Thomas Blackwell was, in fact, exactly the man she had decided he was on a boarding house step in April of 1878, when she said yes, and meant it before he had said a word to earn it. "Elias it is," she said. James Elias was a healthy, vigorous, utterly determined child who crawled at 6 months and walked at 10, and by 18 months was following his father around the barn with a proprietary interest in everything that happened there. The horses regarded him with the tolerant patience of large animals that understand they are expected to accommodate small humans, and Thomas lifted him up to let him put his hand flat against the neck of the big bay mare, and James Elias patted the horse with an expression of enormous satisfaction that his parents both found so thoroughly delightful that Thomas, who was not a demonstrative man in public, picked up Beatrice and turned her around on the barn floor while she laughed. The farm grew steadily through 1880 and 1881. The North Quarter was cleared and producing by the second year. The boarding operation had expanded to a consistent 12 horses through the busiest months, and Thomas had hired a young man named Pete Navarro, the son of a Mexican ranching family who had settled 20 miles east, to help with the horses and the heavier field work. Pete was 17 when he started, a quick learner and a genuinely good hand with horses, and Thomas paid him fair wages and treated him with the respect he'd have wanted shown to himself at that age, which was not universally common in the county, and which Pete's father, when he came to discuss the arrangement, acknowledged with a directness that Thomas found he was glad of. The question of respect for men who were different from the dominant population of Harlan Creek was not a simple one in 1880 Kansas, and Thomas did not pretend it was. He had seen enough of the world working across several states to know that the country's treatment of Mexican-American families, and of the Comanche and Kiowa people whose land this had originally been, was unjust in ways that a single man on a single farm could not fix but could choose, in small daily ways, to not perpetuate. Pete Navarro came to supper at the farmhouse on the evenings he worked late, and ate at the same table, and was spoken to as someone whose opinion mattered, and Thomas held this as simply the correct and obvious way to behave rather than as any particular virtue. Beatrice held the same view, and had said so from the beginning, which was another thing Thomas had noticed about her early and had valued entirely. In the spring of 1881, Beatrice became expecting again, and this time she was more settled with it, more comfortable in the knowledge of what was coming, though no less attentive to the needs of a body doing extraordinary work. She continued teaching through the first months, stepping back in the late summer when the school's terms aligned with her need to rest more, and Mrs. Eleanor Price filled in for the final weeks of September. This second child was a girl, born in a warm October of 1881, with her mother's brown eyes and a quantity of dark hair that made everyone who saw her comment on it. They named her Clara Ruth Blackwell, Clara for the town and Ruth because Beatrice had always loved the story, the loyalty in it, the willingness to go where someone you love was going. Clara Ruth arrived with considerably less drama than her brother had, as if she had already made her decisions and come prepared, and James Elias, by now a robust toddler of 20 months, regarded her from the doorway with the profound suspicion of someone who had been told to expect a sibling and was now reconsidering the arrangement. He came around by Christmas, though. By Christmas, he was bringing her things, carrying over small objects from around the room and placing them near her, with a generosity that was also possibly about demonstrating that all these objects were his, but which was nonetheless sweet. Beatrice watched her 2 children in the firelight of the Christmas evening and felt the fullness of her life as a physical sensation, a warmth that went beyond the iron stove and the wool blankets and the good meal on the table. Thomas sat beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her without looking up from the book he was reading to James Elias, who was propped against his side with the boneless ease of a small child completely comfortable in his location. And the baby was in the crook of Beatrice's arm looking at the firelight with the unfocused wonder of infants. And the farmhouse was warm and filled with the small sounds of a family in the evening. And outside the Kansas winter was cold and wide and indifferent, but inside it was not. The debts were all paid. The land was producing. The name Blackwell in Harlan Creek had been rebuilt into something that meant what Thomas had said it would mean when he put his money on Orville Potts's counter on that first Tuesday morning. A man who pays what he owes and works without stopping and does not run. In the winter of 1882, something happened that brought the whole of what Thomas had built into sharp relief. A hard freeze came in February that destroyed a significant portion of the spring seed stock that he had stored in the outer barn, a loss that would have been catastrophic in the first year, and that now, while serious, was a setback rather than a disaster. He calculated what he needed to replant and what it would cost, and the number was manageable. 3 years earlier it would not have been. He mentioned it to Orville Potts when he came in to discuss seed orders, not to ask for credit, but simply because Potts needed to know what his customers were ordering, and Thomas had long since established the habit of plain dealing with the man. Orville Potts listened, and then did something that Thomas had not expected. He offered Thomas a trade arrangement, a reduction on seed costs in exchange for Thomas's agreement to sell a portion of his sorghum harvest through Potts's distribution connection in Wichita, an arrangement that benefited them both and that Potts presented with the same no-nonsense practicality he applied to everything, but that Thomas understood as something more than a business arrangement. It was Orville Potts, in his particular limited way, deciding that Thomas Blackwell was someone he wanted to do business with as a partner rather than a debtor. It was the final piece of a long transition. Thomas came home from that meeting and told Beatrice, sitting at the kitchen table over supper while James Elias demonstrated his newly acquired ability to feed himself with a spoon, and Clara Ruth observed from her chair with the expression of someone waiting to be impressed. Beatrice listened, and then she said, "Do you remember what you told me the evening you asked me to walk with you down to the creek? About your father?" "I remember," he said. "You said you understood from a young age that you would have to be made of different material," she said. "You were right about that, and you were." He looked at her across the table with the lamplight between them and the children and the supper and the warm house around them and said, "I had help." "You had 30 acres and a debt and a name nobody trusted," she said. "You did not need my help for any of that. I needed you to trust the name," he said, "before I had done anything to deserve it. That is what I needed, and it is what you gave me." She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and James Elias put his spoon down and looked at them both with the profound 3-year-old assessment of parental behavior, and Clara Ruth made a sound of opinion from her chair. "It was easy to trust," Beatrice said. "I just paid attention." "To what?" he asked. "To the way you sat on your horse," she said simply, and he looked at her, and she smiled, and he shook his head with the small, wondering quality that she had been producing in him for nearly 5 years now without any sign of diminishing. By the spring of 1883, the Blackwell farm was what it had always had the potential to be, 30 acres that were working fully, with the north quarter under cultivation, and the barn expanded to hold a reliable 16 horses through the busy months, and a small additional pasture enclosed for Thomas's own 2 horses. Pete Navarro had become indispensable, a full partner in the work, and Thomas had given him a small piece of the North Quarter to develop as his own, a decision he had consulted Beatrice about first, and that she had agreed to without hesitation as the obvious right thing. The farmhouse had been expanded in 1882, a proper addition to the east side that gave the children their own room and gave Beatrice the study she had been managing without, a small room with shelves that ran to the ceiling, and the morning light falling across the desk in a way that made it exactly right for reading, and for the writing she had begun doing, careful notes on teaching methods that she thought might one day be useful to someone beyond Harlan Creek. She had continued teaching through all of it, taking time when she needed it for the children and returning when she could, and the school had grown from 12 children to 22, because families were settling in the county, and some of them, finding that the Harlan Creek schoolteacher was both skilled and serious about the work, arranged themselves to be within her district. She had begun a small lending library in the schoolroom, accumulated through mail orders from St. Louis and through donations from townspeople who had been persuaded that books were a community investment, and it was the library that she was most proud of, more than any single student's progress, because it would outlast any single teaching year and keep giving. Thomas was proud of her for it in the specific, attentive way he was proud of everything she did, which was to notice it clearly and say so, and to make sure that anyone who asked him about his wife understood that the schoolteacher who was building a lending library in the Harlan Creek schoolhouse was doing something as worth talking about as anything happening in the county. Harlan Creek had changed around them, too, in the slow way that towns change. There were new families, new buildings, a second general store that Orville Potts viewed with deep displeasure and competitive intensity. The Red Spur had a new owner who kept it cleaner. Sheriff Dale Hutchins had retired, and a younger man named Ray Coulter had taken the badge, and he and Thomas had an easy mutual respect that Thomas had never quite had with Hutchins. Cade Hargrove had married a woman from Wichita named Helen, who was quietly formidable in the way that some small women are, and she and Beatrice had developed a genuine, if slightly formal friendship that was probably the most surprising social development in the county that year. In the summer of 1883, they had a gathering at the farm, not a party exactly, but a Sunday afternoon where people came, neighbors and ranchers and townspeople, and there was food and the children ran in the south field, while the adults sat in the shade of the barn and talked, and the air smelled of warm grass and the distant cattle, and the cornbread Beatrice had made in the big iron pan that was now a household fixture. Thomas stood at the edge of it, watching the yard full of people, and Beatrice came to stand beside him. "Look at this," she said, and it was both a statement and an observation. He looked. He saw James Elias, now 3½, running in the field with enormous purpose and no particular destination. He saw Clara Ruth in the arms of Clarence Dubois' wife, who had taken to the baby with a warmth that surprised and touched everyone. He saw Pete Navarro talking with Jonas Webb, with the easy back-and-forth of men who have found mutual respect across the differences that a less sensible town might have made insurmountable. He saw Cade Hargrove and Helen sitting on the fence with easy propriety, and Orville Potts trying a piece of cornbread with an expression suggesting he was deciding whether to approve of it. He saw Mrs. Eleanor Price in conversation with two of the newer settler wives, weaving them into the fabric of the community with the quiet skill of a woman who understood that communities are made by the people who bother. "I remember 30 acres and a debt," he said. "And a name nobody trusted," she said. "And a woman who trusted it," he said, and looked at her. She looked back at him with 5 years of history in her eyes and all the days of it clear and present between them, the hard ones and the easy ones and the ordinary ones that were neither but that made up the actual texture of a life together. "I always trusted it," she said. "I just needed you to know that." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into his side, and the Kansas summer was wide and golden around them, and the people they had made their life with moved through the afternoon light, and the farm was alive in every direction, and the children were healthy, and the debts were gone, and the land was good. Later that evening, after the last guests had ridden home and the children were asleep with the satisfying finality of children who have run themselves thoroughly into the ground, Thomas and Beatrice sat on the repaired porch in the warm dark, with the prairie around them and the stars above, very thick and very clear the way they are on a Kansas summer night when the air is dry and the horizon is flat and the whole sky comes down to meet it. "James Elias asked me this morning who I was going to be when I grew up," she said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I was already who I was going to be," she said. "I told him that knowing who you are is the most important part." "What did he say?" "He said he is going to be a horse," she said, and Thomas laughed, the real full laugh that she had been collecting instances of for 5 years, and she laughed with him in the warm dark. When they had stopped laughing, the quiet of the prairie was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled, and they sat in it together as they had learned to sit in silence, which is to say with complete ease. "Thomas," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," he said. "When I came to Harlan Creek," she said slowly, "I was looking for a purpose. I thought purpose was in the work, in the teaching, and it is partly, truly." She paused. "But it is mostly in this. In what we have built. Not the land, not the house, but the," she searched for the right word, "the life of it, the dailiness of it." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the prairie. Then he said, "The dailiness." "Yes," she said, "the way you read in the evenings, the way you come in from the field and you are tired and you still ask how the school day was and you actually listen. The way James Elias looks at you. The way you built the study with the morning light because you knew I needed the morning light." She took a breath. "That is the purpose, not some grand thing, the specific thing." He turned to look at her in the dark, and the starlight was enough to see her face, and she was looking at him with the direct honesty that had been the first thing he noticed, and that still, after 5 years, could make him feel seen in a way he had not known to want. "You gave me that," he said. "You gave me a reason for the specific things to matter. Before you, the work was just work. After you, the work was for something." She reached for his hand, and he took it, and they held on to each other in the dark of a Kansas summer night on a porch of their own making, on land they had reclaimed together, in a life that had been built piece by piece from stubbornness and patience, and the particular power of one person trusting another before the evidence was in. The stars moved slowly overhead, the way they do, indifferent to the human business below but companionable in their vastness, and the prairie breathed around them, and inside the house James Elias was already dreaming about horses, and Clara Ruth was perfectly asleep with the total commitment that babies give to sleep, and the farm was quiet in every direction. Thomas Blackwell had come to Harlan Creek in the spring of 1878 with 30 acres and a debt that could have crushed him, and a name that the town had already decided was not worth the air it took to say. He had come anyway, because he believed a debt was a debt, and a man's name was still the only thing that truly belonged to him. What he had not expected, riding down that south road on a roan horse on a Tuesday morning in April, was that a woman would see him from a schoolhouse window and decide, before a single word had been exchanged, to trust what she saw, and that she would go on trusting it, through every hard month and every doubt and every piece of evidence that the town preferred to offer against it, not blindly, not without judgment, but with the clear-eyed commitment of someone who had paid attention and decided. He had said to her once, on the boarding-house step in an October evening, that trusting his name had made him want to be the man she seemed to think he was. What he understood now, in the fullness of everything they had built, was that she had not been seeing what she hoped for. She had been seeing what was actually there. She had simply seen it before he had finished becoming it. That was the difference, as she said. That was the thing that made all the difference. The night deepened around them, and neither of them moved from the porch, and there was nowhere else in the world they needed to be.